Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, this is the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey friend, you look amazing today. I hope you're having a great day. See what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So it's an absolute no-brainer to hit that subscribe button and join us as we change the world by making our workplaces better. I am here today with Mara Senn. She's the Senior Director. She is the Senior Counsel for Zimmer Biomet, Director of Global Compliance Investigations, and she has a really cool history at the World Bank and a prosecutor for the DOJ. So we're going to have some really fun conversations today. We're having a beach day, as you can see in my background, for those of you watching online. And welcome to the Ethics Experts.
Thanks so much for having me.
So they call you Mara in New York.
They
call you Mara everywhere else. What is it about ethics and compliance? My favorite question always to start off with folks is how did you slip off the log and fall into the ethics and compliance pool? What is your story and getting to where you're at?
Yeah. Great story. Great question. So basically I started as a litigator in private practice, and compliance didn't really exist in the way we think of it now. Mm-hmm. The compliance back then was like OSHA compliance, EPA compliance, much narrower concept of compliance. And so as I got into a lot of securities law and white collar defense and international arbitration. And so when I became partner and people were like, okay, that's great that you're partner. And now what are you going to do to get clients? I thought to myself, what is kind of white collar, but also kind of international? And that's how I ended up with FCPA, because it's both of those things. And, whenever you get into FCPA, I started out in investigations, but as the compliance culture sort of evolved and grew, it became much more a part of FCPA investigations to also look at and evaluate and improve compliance systems within companies. So that's sort of how I fell into it.
So you kind of triangulated across international and white collar, because that's what your background was in. What kind of time period was this? When was this happening?
So I made partner in 2007. So, but I'd done some related stuff before, but really it started in 2007. And so between 2007 and 2016, when I left Arnold and Porter, that whole thing was evolving, and compliance was becoming much more of a discipline and less of a sort of a niche, very specific thing in narrower areas. And now we have, the broad integration of risk compliance with just compliance programs overall. And that's, of course, expanding now because of ESG to incorporate other things like HR, like environment, things that in the past were really not considered directly part of compliance in the way that I think it's going to start as ESG strengthens.
So the way that you just kind of talked about that kind of compliance and ethics is sort of playing this game of risk, of taking over sort of more and more territory, right?
Yeah.
It seems like, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here. Tell me off the air, please. Don't correct me on the air, if that's okay. Just kidding. That FCPA as an initiative that companies had to sort of solve for allowed for this sort of outcropping of a lattice work or a structure to ensure that adherence to this this regulation or this legislation was in place, that caused then sort of systems to be built around it. And now with the expansion into ESG, there's an additional opportunity for us to incorporate or maybe sort of widen the scope of our purview, maybe even more. How is the acceleration of that, when you talk about 2007 to now, there's been a tremendous amount of change in our industry. How have you seen, the rate of expansion of that scope change over time, and what are the catalysts for those things?
Yeah. So the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it really was it is an anti-bribery statute. But the thing about preventing bribery is that it has so many different aspects to it, because you have to look at finance, you have to look at the culture, you need to look at policies. Mm-hmm. So that when that came into the fore, and it's been evolving even within that space. I mean, before it used to be that you would just have third parties and you would do due diligence. That was the big thing on them at first. And now, there's constant check-ins. You have a business sponsor. So every aspect of the compliance has sort of been deepening, broadening. I think the biggest thing more recently is monitoring. So the DOJ expects companies to monitor the data real time so that they can see, for example, if there's an outlier in their financial transactions, like, why is this weird payment going to Indonesia or something when you don't have operations there. So that is sort of the latest and greatest thing that's already part of compliance. It's still in its infancy. I mean, there's still a lot of questions about how to make that an effective tool, because there's so much data out there and there are a lot of false positives. So that's sort of a big area. But then I think we're going to see right now, ESG is really housed in investor relations. The way it started was that there were these, investment funds that were focused on sort of green companies to try to allow investors to invest in companies that really were good stewards of the environment. But now, as it's kind of externalized into a regulation, because people were just lying about, whether they were a green company, that's kind of how it all started. So right now, the investor relations people are taking, in most companies, that's where it sits, and they're taking questions from investors like, what's your sustainability plan, all that kind of stuff. But and right now there are really no standards that have been issued by the US. And so once the standards are issued, the administration of those standards will most likely fall to compliance, is my guess, or some kind of compliance adjacent organization. So that will create a big expansion. And right now, the ESG, there is no limit in it. There's no conceptual limit. So, I mean, it encompasses environment, governance. I mean, there's really no limit to what that could encompass. And then, hopefully compliance won't take over the whole company, because that would be pretty extensive. But I think as ESG gets more rules and regulations around it, that it will end up in compliance and will sort of have a pretty significant shift in or expansion of what compliance does.
Oh man, I have so much to ask you. There was so much in what you just said. So let's kind of start with this opportunity. I'm a very opportunistic person in general. It's how I view the world. And what I heard in a lot of what you just said is a tremendous amount of opportunity for ethics and compliance people to expand their influence, to expand their impact on the world, assuming that we're not just, psychopaths just trying to get more power, but we think that if we can exert our influence in a more meaningful way, then our world can be better or our companies can be better and so forth. To the extent that we're talking about a domestic company that is in the U.S. jurisdiction where there are no sort of comprehensive, standards in place around ESG, what advice would you give to an ethics and compliance professional who's trying to get out ahead of the curve? And what opportunity do you see for us in this sort of, good old days, which I'm sure we'll look back at it on as these good old days before these regulations come out, which they're probably inevitably going to come out,
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of companies, especially companies like Zimmer Biomet, where I work, we're a manufacturer. So companies that are actually have operations that could create green gas emissions, they have already been looking at this for some time to try to minimize the impact on the environment. There are also, more sort of financial institutions that are a little bit one step removed from the actual on the ground. They're going to have, there's a whole very complex sort of different categorization of how intensely risky you are in terms of your footprint environmentally that the SEC has set forth. But essentially, I think a lot of companies have taken steps. I think the problem is that it's not clear what you're measuring against. There's targets, you can create your own targets and then you can report out on that at the SEC, but in your filings, but it's not clear, do you have to have, what is the unit of measure? What, is it as a percentage of, it's hard to know even what your emissions are. I mean, that's up in the air. Should it be related to your percentage of your work that is engaged in pollution causing activities? Should it be as a function of your revenue? So there's a whole bunch of outlying issues, but I think people already are engaging in what they think is right for their company, that they will hopefully be able to sort of adjust and adapt when they have to report this on their SEC reports. I think the most important thing for all of these processes is transparency. If you're actually going to publicly report what you're doing, you just need to make sure that you're like, this is our methodology, this is our this is how we measure it. This is what we want our target to be, and this is where we are on our journey towards that target. And then if the methodology changes because the SEC, comes forward and says, okay, these are the standards, then you can say, we used to use this, and now what we've done is we've changed it in this way so now we come up with a number that is comparable to everybody else that the SEC has set forth as the standard.
Yeah, I guess to the extent that you're willing to be transparent and not obfuscate that sort of recipe, it's not only going to allow for someone to be more, to have more clarity in assessing from their own subjective lens how ESG-ish you are. It'll also allow for, kind of a track record or an audit trail, for lack of a better term, as those methodologies change or as regulations come down that you now have to adhere your new reporting standards toward.
Exactly. And I mean, one thing that I think is really interesting, I was an econ major in college, so we talk about externalities, which is basically something that's not included in what you're, in the model. So like in your business model previous to this, there was no real punishment besides like if you violated EPA regulations or something like that. There was no punishment for a company who was polluting because that was an externality. They just emitted it and then that was gone.
Right.
So this is like the first time and that's what makes it so difficult. Like you can measure how many widgets you make, you can measure how much money you make, you can measure your costs, but it's really, really difficult. There's no feedback loop for how much you're emitting because it's really been a difficult, it's hard to say, okay, if I'm doing, driving, we're driving trucks to deliver that, but it's our third parties who are doing it. Do we incorporate that? Like there's just a whole supply
I got a
chain
joint venture over here. How much of that do I get to?
Exactly. So there's all these kind of accounting questions. And so it's really interesting because as far as I can think of, there may be some that I'm not thinking of, but this is the first time like an externality that's really external to the company has to be brought in and considered. And it's technically difficult. It's accounting wise, it's difficult. So it's going to be a big challenge, I think, for the regulators to also set the standards because my husband's a scientist and he's like, you can't even measure, what you're doing. There's no, and he's even at NIST, that's what they do is they create measurements. Right. He's like, there are people working on this right now and there's no scientific way to objectively measure, emissions in the way that they're talking about where you're saying, you can measure like the rise in temperature, like, over the whole world or whatever. But like, it's very hard to say this truck emitted this and it's comparable to something else that is, not exactly the same. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah. It's not like, in economics, we talk about utils as a measurement thing to like illustrate some kind of a framework or some kind of a principle. We're not in a laboratory, we're in the real world. So to your point, there's like layers and layers of complexity that that make it very difficult for us to come down to like a specific unit of measure in to your point, just the emissions area. Right. Let alone, I don't know, how about the social area? How about the governance area? Like, how are you going to quantify these things? And it's an interesting problem. I don't think kind of in general, the difficulty of like incorporating externalities into, a report card, just the fact that it's difficult shouldn't like prevent us trying to do that. I mean, at some level, the impact that we all have in our world, just let's look at like a general compliance program, the cultural impact that a strong sort of integrity-based compliance program has on its company that in itself is a bunch of positive externalities, right? Like there's a bunch of positive externalities that end up leading to the expansion of margin, the more employee engagement because they believe in the mission of the company, more lower turnover, all those positive externalities, which are again sort of difficult to corral. It doesn't mean that we don't stop doing those things because we can't make that direct connection, but it does make it more difficult, to your point, to roll something out comprehensively across different industries, different jurisdictions, different sort of ESG exposures, to the extent that those are like individual pillars that each company in its own operation is going to have different sort of exposure to come down with like a score. Like we're not rating bonds, for example. You know what I'm saying? Bond ratings, irrespective of industry, you can come up with some kind of a score, and that's sort of it's a pretty good like methodology that Moody's and these other rating agencies have found, but it's going to be a challenge to do that. Again, not saying it's impossible, but I would love to hear your comments about, like, I think Europe has some standards that I think some of us might say are a little bit bizarre. What problems would us sort of just adopting these European standards present if we just brought them over here?
Well, obviously our regulators are looking at those standards to see, which would be appropriate and which would not be appropriate. But I think that they are a little bit ahead of us, but they haven't cracked the code either. And so, I think there's just a lot of, a lot of what the EU has required. They've always been ahead of us, for example, on human rights, and they're much stricter about workers' rights as well. So there are a lot of standards that they've set forward that might not work here. But I think and I'm not sure. Part of the problem I think at the SEC is they don't. At least historically, I'm sure they've been hiring people. Historically, they don't have any expertise outside of the pure market-driven issues, Right. And so they're having to kind of build up this whole, since they're the ones who are primarily regulating it, they're having to build up these, personnel expertise in all these areas that they previously have not had expertise in. In the government, there are places like in the EPA and at DOJ, like the environmental section, where they've been suing, people who have been violating EPA standards and stuff for years. Yeah. The SEC does have a history of like suing people who are lying about their disclosures. Yep. But now we're talking about a completely different level, because they're going to say, the purpose of this really is to allow consumers and investors to compare apples to apples. So if you have three, just to use Zimmer Biomet as an example, if you have three companies that are manufacturing implants, we do knee and hip implants, and obviously we have competitors. If you're a quote unquote green investor, you might want to say, okay, well, Zimmer Biomet compared to these other people who are doing the exact same thing, Zimmer Biomet has better numbers, therefore we're going to invest in them. And so those numbers have to be comparable. Yeah, right. Right. And so that's the complicated part. But in terms of, Europe is definitely in front of us, and that's helpful in some ways, because then it does give you an opportunity, the regulators, to kind of see what it is and isn't working. But Europe also has a lot more, their government is more intrusive than our government is. And so there are probably things that they can do that we as a government can't do as easily. And so that could be some of the challenges too.
Yeah. So I think those are great points. That sort of the sort of ethos, or just the sort of nature of the market over there, is so different. That might afford some different sort of points of leverage, but just the fact that something is happening that as our own sort of standards begin to emerge from the primordial soup, there's probably some lessons to learn there. Let's do this. How do you feel about a thought experiment? I love them.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm game.
Okay. So let's fast forward. It's 10 years from now, and ESG, we look back on it and we're like, oh yeah, remember that? Yeah. That fell flat, huh? What happened? What did we get wrong? How did this end up? And I guess a corollary to what I'm kind of talking about in this thought experiment is like corporate social responsibility. That movement that kind of fell flat, as well intentioned as it was.
Yeah.
How, ESG is like even a bigger joke than that, assuming it's a joke, not trying to be rude to whoever invented CSR. What happened? What did we get wrong?
Well, I think the difference, and we'll see how this plays out, the difference between social corporate responsibility, which is very similar in some ways to ESG, although social corporate responsibility was always much more driven by the corporation and they wanted to be good citizens, whereas this is more externally focused. I mean, there wasn't really a governmental push to regulate the things that we're talking about. I mean, one thing that I think is very interesting and different is the younger generations, and I mean, not me, but much younger, they really care about environmental things. They really care about human rights. Where does my, I remember when this kind of trend happened in restaurants, which I thought was sort of goofy, but somewhat entertaining, where they'd say this, this chicken was raised on a ranch where they had all their relatives together and then we killed them together and
her
whatever.
name was Carol.
Yeah, exactly. There was like a whole journey about that. But I almost think that kind of was the beginning of this, explanation where people want to know, like, when I'm buying things, when I'm wearing things, when I'm consuming things, where does it come from? So it's both different in that the government is pushing regulations, but it's also different because the public actually cares, the younger generations. So I think it probably has a better staying power. I think there's going to have to be limits. One thing, I was on a panel about ESG with somebody from the SEC, and the thing that the key driving factor for most SEC violations are whether something is material. Is it material to the revenue? Is it material to the investor? And the problem with ESG is that there's no materiality standard, because it's like, okay, is two people who are like, there's an Blizzard Activision where they were, hit with an SEC case for sexually harassing a lot of people. And in the end, California started investigating them, and then the SEC picked it up, and ultimately the CEO had to step down. So it ended up being material. But at the time, like, is one person being sexually harassed material? Is 20 is a certain percentage? Like, there is no materiality standard. And same thing for ESG. Like, is it, do you have a material deviation? Like, you report something and then you say, we emitted X number of bad things in terms of pollution. And then you have to do an adjustment, like, actually we did our calculations or something changed. And now we have to say that we emitted 20% more. Is that a material change?
Right.
I mean, nobody knows. So it's a lot easier to do with money than it is to do with all these kind of intangibles. And so I think that's the part that's going to be long-term tricky. Like, and also, is there any limiting factor? I mean, since when is HR, like in a company, you have compliance, and that's completely separate from HR. I mean, we of course coordinate and cross-pollinate all the time, but like compliance is typically not responsible for ensuring like a good sexual harassment policy and a good, equality policy. That's just not within their functionality typically. But now if it's going to be considered an ESG violation, if you have bad HR policies, then that kind of blurs the line with HR and compliance, or does HR have to become more like compliance? So there are a lot of like practical implications of this. And I think if it fails, it will be because the concept is so unlimited that, it's going to stop meaning something. There may then just end up being, regulations on the environment and, regulations on the supply chain, but then it'll stop being called ESG because ESG is just like everything that ever existed.
Yeah. It'll start getting a bunch of extra letters.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And, I think another challenge, so that was a great rundown. What a great episode this is. I usually don't even comment mid episode. This is phenomenal. So what about, so here's one thing that I think it can fall flat on is like, it's so easy to game. You know what I'm saying? Like, to your point, I mean, let me get super like draconian about it. If there's a way that I as a rational actor scruples aside, am able to get a lower cost of capital if I can pull together some report that doesn't need to have any true basis. If I can get a lower cost of capital from my lender, for example, or get better investments, if I can put something together with my investment committee and the CFO, what's going to stop me from doing that? I mean,
that's why they're working on the standards.
Yeah.
But of course, and that raises a whole other point, which is exactly follow on from what you said, which is, okay, now I've declared that I have 100 bad things from emissions. Who's going to go? Normally, if the SEC, you can get an auditor, you can get. Right. So how do you get an auditor to go in? And you're going to have to now have the SEC hiring environmental engineers. That's
an E auditor, an S auditor, a G auditor, to your point.
Right.
And then that's going to fractal out by industry.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that is a whole other thing, because the answer to your question is the way that it's stopped, at least in theory by the SEC, is they have standards, they test against the standards. But the way that you normally test is like, if you have an audit, then you have to present your audit findings. Right. So they're going to have to create a whole new, kind of industry of people who are going to test and then we have, are your sensors being correct? Because there was that whole thing with Volkswagen where they tweaked the sensors. Like, how are you going to detect that? How are you going to say, basically right now, green energy is just not evolved enough, I think, to do a lot of the things that you would have to do, both to detect and also to audit. And so that is going to be a really, again, this is why it's like a moving area. And a lot of people are working on it for climate change and all these things. So hopefully there'll be a lot of advances in that area, but we're not there yet, basically.
Yeah. The inability to sort of denominate everything in a single currency, so to speak, or put it the other way, the ability to denominate everything into a single currency, even in different jurisdictions or different countries, you can translate those things back to a single currency to come up with that materiality and denominate it all in one thing. And you can measure a lot easier, and it allows for a lot, the average auditor, even if they're not maybe they've worked in finance their whole time, they could probably find 80% accuracy if they were doing a healthcare audit. It's not that different. It's still accounting, it's still finance, and still dollars.
Right, but the thing is, you have to know that the underlying measurement is not BS.
Correct.
Right? So,
correct.
So there's the whole added before,
Correct.
Like you could say how many, I know there were X number of surgeries. I can check that. I can get backup documentation.
That's right.
For this, you're like, okay, my backup documentation is the reading from a machine that has not really been proven. And so, at some point they will, of course, have standards where they're like, okay, this machine is X% accuracy and stuff like that. Again, we're not there yet.
Right.
So that's kind of the problem, is that they have to go back to the methodology. You can't really, at this point, you can't say one unit a bad thing is verifiable if you use this machine. Right. None of that, the measurements part of it doesn't even exist. So it's
to your husband's point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of a fascinating thing. This whole issue, this whole problem, on the one hand, it seems like such a great opportunity if we can get it right and companies can actually do well by doing good, or vice versa, whatever. That's great. But, cynically, there's been so many stories that have come out about, essentially greenwashed ESG funds, which are really just the regular fund, with just a new name and a higher fee. That's
how we got ESG. That's exactly how we got ESG, because all these people did exactly what you were saying, cynically said, we're going to appeal to the green investors. Who cares if we're not really green? And then the SEC said, wait a second, this is crazy. We need to get some standards in place. And that's kind of how ESG came about. Mm-hmm. But we're just still in hey, we need standards in place. We don't have the standards. Once the standards come into place, first of all, there has to be science that says, okay, yes, we can measure this. Then there has to be standards that say, okay, once we measured it, this is where it's going to fall into. And then there has to be implementation of it. People have to start reporting. SEC starts measuring, and presumably a whole industry will build up around it in terms of technology, personnel, all this expertise that is probably in a much narrower place now. But when there are jobs and opportunities, more people will move into that. like I know in Stanford, some really rich billionaire guy, I forget who it is, somebody that people have probably heard of, but I can't remember his name, gave $1 billion for a school within Stanford specifically on climate change. So there are going to be people coming up who are going to be technically interested and trained in this area. Yeah. And so hopefully this will be like one of those kind of green energy adjacent kind of industries that will spawn some expertise and also new innovations about how to measure and how to confirm the information that we're getting.
So what about someone who's in, your sort of average, middle of the bell curve company? Maybe it's not even public. They're still in a market where people, care about the name of the chicken that they're eating. You know what I'm saying? What should they be doing to get out ahead of that curve? Or what should they be doing to help put some of those structures in place so that when this new industry turns on and that switch is flipped, they're a little bit further down the road? And how can they also, second part of the question, how can they also use that sort of to expand their influence in the organization, particularly if they feel like that influence is lacking currently?
Are you talking about companies or individuals?
I'm talking about individuals. I'm talking about somebody who, they're in a company, they're a compliance officer, they're an ethics officer. They don't feel like, how do they take advantage of this ESG opportunity in its nascent state right now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the most important thing is to start going to is read other companies' sustainability reports. Like I know we have one I think it's like 100 pages because it's all these different categories of things we're doing and looking at. And a lot of companies, especially public companies, have sustainability reports, and that will have all of what they interpret to be ESG as it relates to their company. Because like I said before, you have different risk areas. If you're a manufacturer, you have one risk profile. If you are, really more, just on the phones and stuff, you have a completely different risk factor. So, but every company, just like with any risk, they evaluate what is relevant to them, and then they try to mitigate those risks. So I think if you're in-house at some kind of company and you want to expand your knowledge, you're going to look to public companies that are in your sector and find out, meaning you have a similar profile, and find out what they're doing. And like I said, for the public companies, a lot of times they'll have these sustainability reports, and you can read them and say, oh, wait, we're not doing this, or we're doing this. I know one person I know, they had been doing, they're like a big manufacturing company. They had been doing a lot of what is now considered ESG, but that was just part of their, operations. They didn't really have it as a separate program, but then they basically rebranded it. It was the same thing, but they sort of wrapped it all together, took all the different parts that they were already doing and sort of wrapped it up into a bow, and that became their ESG program. And so I think a lot of companies have been doing parts of this already. And so part of it, I think, is kind of wrapping it up, identifying it, categorizing it, and then giving it to the investment folks to talk to their investors about what's going on. But if you're not really in that position yet, I think sustainability reports of these, various different companies, many different companies, are a great place to start because it's very specific. It's very kind of nuts and bolts. The companies talk about what they've done.
Do you feel like the average compliance individual is maybe more able to make sense of the ESG situation for their company than just a random run-of-the-mill other person, in that they have to pull things from multiple different departments, and to the extent that they're the circulatory system of the organization in terms of providing guidance? Like, do you think that that's an accurate kind of characterization?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, as a compliance personnel, you're looking at systems, like what is breaking down, how can you improve them? I think one of the things right now is because so much of this ESG is housed, not everywhere. Sometimes their chief compliance officer also gets ESG, but a lot of places it's really investment relations right now. And so I think that one of the things that can be difficult for compliance professionals is right now in some companies, they're not designated as the ESG person.
Right.
But I think, like I said, it'll evolve to that much more. And so I think that, compliance professionals should try to liaise with wherever the ESG is housed. They can reach out to those people and say, hey, listen, I was wondering if this would have any implication for the compliance program. Let me tell you a little about what we do. And then there can be sort of a back and forth where you can start implementing or at least understanding the thrust of your own company's ESG program, and then kind of predict or even offer to help with the investor relations. Like they may say, oh, we're trying to roll this out. And it might be the right place to house it might be compliance. So I think having a dialogue with the folks who are if there is an ESG function at your company, engaging with them and sort of seeing where the opportunities lie for overlap, evolution, in terms of the interaction between ESG and compliance.
So, let's think about there's this is like a 4-box model, and across the top we have let's use the word sustainable as a proxy for ESG, okay? For like this whole ESG thing. So on the top we have sustainable, and we have a column for actually sustainable and not actually sustainable. And then going down the side, we have perceived to be sustainable by the external market or by investors or whatever. Where do you think the biggest risks are from someone trying to stand up a program? And where do you think the biggest, not trying to lead the witness here, but where do you think the biggest, where's the battle won or lost in the eyes, in this matrix? Does the matrix make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one issue I would say is what does that mean, sustainable? Does it mean zero emission? Does it mean that, you've minimized what you can? Because if it means zero emission, there's sometimes you just can never get there. And so again, I think it's going to end up being within your, if you can beat the expectations within your sector, whatever that is, that's going to be your differentiator. So if
great point. Okay.
And so basically, if you're, it'll be good and bad. If you're the big leader, there are 5 companies, they all do the same thing. They all manufacture widgets. And they all manufacture the same widgets, and they're all in the Midwest, just to make it easier and sort of more equal. And company 1 has 50% lower emissions than all the other 4. So on the one hand, they're the ones who are winning the war on sustainability because they're looking better than their competitors. But on the other hand, they're also going to be the target of the SEC because they're going to be what the hell's going on with this? Right. So I think a lot of
Great point. Okay.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the, what I think is going to end up happening is it is going to end up have standardization to the extent we can get standardization among different companies in the same sector, but then each company is going to have to differentiate themselves and say, well, the reason that I'm, so much more of an emitter than that is because I'm not really truly just a manufacturing company. Mm-hmm. I also, fly all these jets as part of our thing, and jet fuel is hugely polluting. And so therefore, unlike company A, we have higher emissions because we have this other function, because there's so many, it's hard to say that one company is exactly like the other because of all the different business lines people have. So I think it's going to be really interesting, but that's, I think, how people are going to distinguish themselves. I'm like this company to some extent. And if you do apples to apples, my line of business is just like their line of business. We're better. But overall, we're worse because this other line of business is much more polluting. But then, the third company also has this really polluting side, and we're better than them too. So that's kind of how I think the companies are going to kind of distinguish themselves.
And great. That was a great rundown. And at some level, this gets totally complicated by the fact that everything you were talking about was just one face of this investment analysis cube, right? Because there's another facet of it that's about, well, what's the financial returns of the company? And 100%. Then someone's trying to make a portfolio decisions, and they're obviously going to make some attribution analysis, and they're going to say, okay, is this differential in terms of stock returns or It just adds like another massive sort of amorphous factor in this
100%.
multivariate equation to probably misattribute return performance to different like levels of, prioritization or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, it'll be really interesting to see. There'll be so much more data, as it gets rolled out, because then eventually over time, there may be zero correlation to, just like how they have diversity has this correlation to more productivity. Is it a causation? Is it a correlation? No one knows. But then we don't even know for environmental stuff because it's not been internalized yet. But we'll get to a point where, in 5, 10, 15 years, where they'll say, okay, well, you know what, over time, companies that are more sustainable, however you define that, save money on X, Y, and Z, and therefore their returns on average are better. And then it will be, those two things will merge. Like, okay, yes, maybe right now we're not seeing the environmental benefit on the bottom line, but we know within 5 years, based on the statistics, whatever that ends up coming out, we know that on average, companies that have 20% less emissions have, 10% more earnings over a 10-year period, whatever, like I'm just making that up. But there'll be data on that. I'm not sure it'll be conclusive, but people will, of course, draw inferences with the data they have. So that will be definitely another factor that people take into consideration once they can sort of characterize the value and have a little more information about it.
So this should have been like a 2-hour episode because I got a bunch of other stuff I wanted to ask you about. So I mean, it's just going to be kind of interesting. It's kind of an exciting time to be in our industry because there's so much change going on. And I know that, there's that old saying that the only thing that's constant is change and everything's changing all the time. But like I've worked in other industries that don't seem to be changing on such massive scales as ours is. And it's and I just want to go back to that question. Do you feel like the rate of change sort of now and over the next 5 years, let's say, is going to be different over, the last 10 years or something like that? Or do you think it's kind of just been constant kind of waves washing across the shore and you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I personally think it's going to be constant because I'm skeptical that they're going to get this together soon enough for it to be a seismic change right away. I mean, I think it's, I think a lot of and this is true in every part of compliance, is you start at like monitoring is at that phase now. Okay, we know what monitoring is. We're trying to find stuff. People are doing all these algorithms and trying to figure it out. But you get a lot of junk when you do monitoring. And so it's like you got to figure out how to get value out of it by identifying problems in a sensible way. And I think that, as ESG evolves, it'll be the same thing. At first, it'll be like, oh, we've got to measure X, Y, and Z. And then we'll say, okay, well, this actually is not measurable. So we're going to exclude that and we're going to bring this in and we're going to use these new machines. So kind of as things evolve, I just think people will get smarter about it and realize what's practical, what's not practical, what's effective, what's not effective. And that will sort of drive to a certain extent, how much things change. And then, of course, like market pressure to your point, like will investors say, okay, this is really important to us now that we can quantify it. And they may have a differentiator. Like they may say, what we really care about is greenhouse gas emissions. Right. What we don't care about is, the volume of trash that you put into a landfill. I mean, who knows? But there may be like differentiators that kind of push compliance or the program in one direction or the other as well. Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking about this, this data accumulation over time, there's this, I'm sure you've heard of it. This company, Ethisphere, puts out the world's most ethical companies, and they have the ethical company premium. And this year, when they put it out, it was up to like 24.8% or something, right? 25% outperformance from ethical companies relative to the general peer group. And what I still find interesting is that, I don't know, I mean, that seems like a pretty big number, first of all. And second of all, there's obviously some sort of coherent way that those calculations are built. Yet still, ethics and compliance folks are still underfunded. They still don't have the tools they need. They still don't have the respect they need. The light bulbs have not turned on at the top. What do you think we can learn from that sort of dynamic so that that doesn't happen on this side?
I think we can learn that. I mean, we're heroes. I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, I think, look, I work in a company that went through 2 monitorships. They get it. One of the reasons I wanted to go work there is because, once you're sort of beaten into submission, you really care about compliance, but that's obviously far from the norm, which I completely understand because I've worked for many companies before that had not undergone that experience and were not super dedicated to compliance. I mean, I think you need to show your value add, but the problem is until something terrible has happened, companies don't really believe that something bad will happen. Like They think it's sort of, so, I think that basically what you do is you educate people about what's happened to other companies if it's not yours and say, look, we really don't want to be those companies. And if you want to avoid that, here are a few practical things we can do. So I think that's kind of the best way to do it.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like the most healthy people are people that have had a triple bypass surgery or something. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, this has been so much fun. I wanted to talk about the World Bank and the DOJ stuff, so maybe we can have you back do something again soon. But thank you so much for joining us.
It was great.
It was really a great conversation, and let's absolutely stay in touch. Where can people get in touch with you? How about leave me alone, maybe? How about
no. I mean, you can email me. I would give you my work email, but I think it would be kind of weird to get stuff there. Yeah. So you can just email me at Mara Senn, MARASENN, 1 @gmail.com.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Mara. It's been an absolute blast. I learned so much. Don't be surprised if you see me on webinars saying a lot of the stuff you said. I am like a absolute thief of smart things that I hear.
No worries.
Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Great to talk to you.
Until next time.
Bye.